Hello and welcome to this video. I've wanted to make this video for quite some time. It's a video that kind of walks through different ways to enter poetry, whether you're just trying to appreciate it and love it, or whether you're trying to think about it more deeply, maybe in the context of a class or just yourself. So I call this Not All Water is Baptism, some tips for reading and enjoying poetry. First, one of my favorite contemporary poets. He's probably the most read poet in English. You can make that case. Poet laureate from the early 2000s, Billy Collins, who says, "High school is the place where poetry goes to die." And as a high school teacher, I think that's often true, and it makes me sad. I think there's lots of reasons for this, and maybe that's a separate video. But one of my goals in this presentation is to maybe begin the conversation about ways to reanimate the reading of poetry, to make it a joy and to make it an exercise really in just paying close attention, which is really what it's about. So here are some things to consider that I can't avoid. So just some sort of pre-game, pre-reading thoughts. First, pick any collection of poems from any time period. Go to your library or bookstore and just, sit and flip through. And if any book hits you, take that book out. So if you're looking for a kind of a traditional choice, maybe something you read a little bit in high school, but you want to revisit, Robert Frost is both readable and understandable on the first read, and he also rewards deeper reading. Misery Islands is a collection of poetry by a friend of mine named January Gill O'Neill, who's a really, really great contemporary poet and a professor at a local college where my daughter goes, actually. And then third, recently deceased poet Stephen Dunn, who I love. And this is my favorite collection of his, Different Hours. These are just three, if you're looking. But there's no wrong answer here. Just the way to start reading poetry is to read poetry and trust what you love. So next, poetry does demand your full attention. So find a private, quiet place. Noise-canceling headphones are a gift, particularly like me if you have a house with teenagers in it. They think the same, actually, that noise-canceling headphones are a gift to keep me away. But, unless you have sort of a supreme focusing ability, reading this on the train or on a car ride or in a loud cafeteria is just not where to dedicate your time to poetry. Relax and calm your mind. I think that's kind of self-evident, but often we go from, if you're a student, you go from, your math homework to your physics homework. Okay, now poetry, as if that's the same kind of mental activity. And I think if you just take like 60 seconds and just calm your mind first, your mind will be attentive in a different way. An essential thing, poetry is not a textbook. Poetry is a bodily, physical, verbal activity. It's meant to be read out loud. Poets often say they'll revise even short poems 30, 40, 50, 60 times, often by listening to the music and the texture of the words in their mouth. So honor that by reading the poems that you love out loud. Maybe the most important thing, and Billy Collins has a famous poem called The Trouble with Poetry on this subject, that because most of us only read poetry for teachers who are going to then make a test you on it or make you write a paper on it, there's this sense that poetry is meant to be figured out, as if it's a lock you have to find the combination to. And that's really not the point. I think it's good to think deeply about poetry and to figure out, why we like what we like. But the point of it isn't only to figure it out. And frankly, as someone who's been teaching for 25 years, I'm not even sure what figuring it out even means. But I think take the pressure off yourself to sound smart. If you have a life behind you of trying to get A's and reading poetry and writing about it is just another physics test for you. I'm sorry to pick on physics today. It isn't that. Okay, so just really take the pressure off yourself and just approach it humbly for what it is and what it gives you. And then another thing, begin with a really good text. You can always start with your feelings. And I know that sounds hokey, but a good text offers you so many things to consider that whatever you're reacting to is worth talking about and thinking about more deeply. So I always say to my students and to any adult readers, if you're responding to a question in a poem or an image in the poem, or that a character in a poem reminds you of a loved one or whatever, start there. That's fine. It's your entry point. And the beautiful thing about reading poetry with a class or a group of people is that people's entry points are different because we're different, and poetry really highlights that fact. So I'm going to share some ways of paying attention to poetry, and this is an incredibly incomplete presentation. So I am in no way suggesting that this is the magical formula. These are just some things that I've learned, probably by reading poetry badly and teaching poetry badly for a long time. So behind this presentation, frankly, is many years of trial and error. So a poem I want to use as a model that we're going to look at several times is one of my favorite poems, maybe because I'm a dad, maybe because I'm a son, maybe, I don't know. I think there's lots of reasons I like it, but it's by this poet here, Robert Hayden, and it's called Those Winter Sundays. So let me move my bouncing head. We'll start just by reading it. Again, no pressure to understand it, no pressure to feel smart. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Now, what I would do now is in a journal somewhere, or if you prefer more using a computer, that's fine. Write down your initial thoughts and questions. So if you want to pause the video here, that's fine. I'll show you now what my initial questions and thoughts were. So early thoughts and feelings, and I hate reading slides to people, but this is like an exception. The speaker's childhood was really difficult, full of scary moments in the house he grew up in. He fears angry sounds, chronic angers, and also admits that his father does all kinds of nice things for him. This is a complicated house and a complicated life. His dad seems both cruel and kind at the same time. I can imagine a kid writing something similar to this, which is why I wrote that way. The poet reminds me of, and I'm just going to say, even though you're probably discouraged if you're a student from using sort of first-person pronouns and personal stories in a traditional essay for school, entering poetry in an autobiographical, personal way is awesome. Imagine writing a poem about your relationship with your grandmother, and someone tells you, "Wow, that really reminded me of my relationship with my grandmother." That's gonna be really a great thing. So I think this is a good little prompt. So start with first thoughts and feelings, write a little bit, and then if you want to, the poem reminds me of, and in my case, it does remind me of my grandfather, whose life was really difficult. He had family challenges. He lived through the Depression, through war. He was a firefighter and endured some difficult times. He could be cruel, particularly verbally with his family, but then he also could be incredibly kind. He was an amazing grandfather to me. He was really complicated, a complication that I know now as an older person that I didn't know as a kid. But anyway, don't skip this step. Write about your feelings and thoughts, your initial feelings and thoughts, and then write about anything that you're reminded of. Okay, an essential component. Honor the poem by looking up the words you don't know. If you have a reading comprehension obstacle, get rid of the obstacle. So I think for most folks that are under a certain age, they might not know what a banked fire is. So you'll notice here I have a basic definition of the term, and then I have the connotation, the feeling, the texture of the words that I think is important. So he mentions banked fires. To bank a fire is to cover it and ensure that it continues at a low burn. So if you bank a fire at night correctly, it'll burn throughout the night and keep the house warm. So the connotation, the feeling around this word, it's sort of a technical word. Austere, which means having an extremely plain and simple style or appearance, unadorned, not fancy, basic. The connotation or feeling of this word is it's a formal, sort of educated, older person's word, right? And then the word offices, which is maybe the most peculiar word in the poem. Offices is a very old word for duty or task. Um, Shakespeare uses it for this reason a lot. He uses it in Othello, actually. Connotation and feeling is, again, a very old, serious word. So, okay, so those are some words that we probably wouldn't know. So let me just think about them, and you can, for any of the poems, any words you don't know, maybe kind of now journal quickly on maybe what those words are doing. So this is what I did: banked fires. The dad didn't just make a fire or light a fire. He took his time and created a banked fire by hand, slowly, to make sure his family was warm during the night. This is a sign of love and care. That last sentence is a leap. In your journaling and writing, make leaps. I think so often our writing is weak, not because we're technically bad writers or we don't know where the commas go. We're sometimes fearful of, or we sometimes don't trust our next thought. Trust it. What's the worst that can happen? The poetry police are not going to come and get you. Austere and lonely offices. Austere means simple and bare bones. And this is what this dad's love is like. It's not flashy. He isn't the dad who will be really affectionate and tell you that he loves you. He's the dad that makes sure you're warm. He loves with his actions. The offices or tasks of love are austere and lonely. So this dad seems true in the poem and in life. This kind of love actually reminds me of my dad. He wasn't one to say I love you, but he was at every game and every play. And there again, like my life, my personal life trickles in. That's fine. This isn't a mathematical formula. Your life matters as much as the life of the poem. And when they intersect, beautiful. So anyway, take a moment when you read a poem and reflect on the words you had to look up. Don't just look up the words. Reflect on what those peculiar new words to you are doing in the poem, you think. Okay, so what do we notice now? Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor and the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? You'll notice, actually, a little side note, that now that I pay closer attention to those words like offices, I'm going to actually read the poem differently. I'm going to punctuate that word because it's the closing word of the poem. And now that I know what it means and why it's important, I might read it differently. Okay, so now that we've had our initial reaction, we've looked up words, a little bit of writing, maybe write a little bit more. So this early stage is just basic emotional response to the poem, and just look up stuff you don't know. So this paragraph is, after I've done those two things, do a little bit of writing. I'm fascinated by the fact that both the father and the speaker are morally complex. Father does the small tasks of love, yet struggles with anger. The son is an innocent victim of the angry house, and also admits, probably as the adult speaker of the poem, that he was ungrateful for all the kindnesses of his father, even though he now realizes, sorry about the spelling, that his father worked really hard and could have prioritized his own rest. The father is who he is throughout the poem, but the speaker seems to evolve. We move from no one ever thanked him to what did I know of love's austere and lonely offices. That's something I noticed just this time reading. And you're going to do this. The more you read and just pay close attention, you'll notice little things that he started by saying, no one ever thanked him. Not talking about himself. That's maybe scary. No one, third person, impersonal. And then he ends by saying, what did I know? Right? He admits something at the end. He regrets not noticing his father's way of loving him. Has the speaker learned from his father's example? What's the speaker's family life like now? What are the little nameless acts of love that people do for me every day, whether I notice them or not? So this poem forces me to ask myself these questions. You'll notice if you're a student and you're wondering, how do I write papers on poetry? We're not there yet, right? If you read poetry for the sole purpose of writing papers about poetry, the papers will be completely lifeless. Relax, emotionally respond, autobiographically respond. Um, that's a starting point. And you'll notice there's some nuggets here. We're looking at two morally complicated characters. We're starting to notice some technical things, but I'm not getting bogged down in technical terms or anything. This is the beginning of thinking about poetry. Okay, so let's imagine you're in a reading group. Let's imagine you're just a person who's curious. Let's imagine you're a student. What if you want to go deeper? So I have some suggestions. So first, this is always seemingly self-evident. Poetry is obviously made up of strategically organized words, so pay attention to the words. The technical term, right, for words in a literary text is diction, so pay attention to diction. And a basic thing you can always ask yourself is, what's the poem's most important detail or word? Okay. And what I did is I went through each stanza and I underlined what I consider to be particularly strange or interesting little moments in each stanza. Sundays too, meaning he does this every day, even on days off. And that highlights the extent to which this guy loves his family, right? But then chronic angers, that word chronic does a lot of work, right? He doesn't say, my parents have been fighting for all kinds of years and my mother, had an affair and my father's abuse. He just uses one little word to cover all that potential ground. So we have the undying, continuous, consistent day-to-day love of the father. We have the consistent day-to-day anger of the house. And then I'm just interested whenever an artist repeats himself. What did I know? What did I know? That it seems like it's emphasizing his regret. Um, so those are the word moments. And what you can do if you were to reduce any sort of close reading of poetry to one thing, summarize the I hate doing this, but summarize the poem like a quick Amazon summary or Hollywood summary. So um, man remembers the complicated love of his father, you know and then take any moment and connect it to that. So Sundays too, well, that's part of the love of his father. And chronic angers, part of the complicated love of his father. What did I know? What did I know? That's part of the complicated nature of this speaker's remembering the love of his father. So if you have a really good text, if you give the sort of Hollywood summary of the text, every detail of the text should enhance and say something specific and interesting about that summary. So that's just a little trick. So because it's poetry, because it's literature, it isn't just chunks of meaning. If you wanted to write an essay about regret, he would have done that. He doesn't. He writes a poem. So always ask yourself, and this is really good readers of poetry are very attuned to this, and songwriters and poets they pay close attention to how their words sound in the ear and how they feel in the mouth. So what's the poem's most interesting sounding phrase or line? And I went through. Blue, black, cold, cracked hands that ached, cold, splintering, breaking. And then I wrote again, love's austere and lonely offices. Blue, black, cold is very harsh and staccato. Cracked hands, cold, splintering, breaking. And it seems that we have Sundays too. My father got up early. We have when the rooms were warm, he'd call. I would rise and dress. It's a very rhythmically beautiful poem. And then there's moments where that rhythm is fractured and breaks and is sort of harsh and it just feels different. Now, if you're an English teacher watching this, or if you're an experienced poetry reader, you'll know this like metrical terms that I could talk about. I could talk about iambic pentameter. I'm not doing that yet. I'm just paying attention to sounds. There's a lot of consonant, heavy, abrupt, harsh, blue, black, cold, splintering, breaking, right? We could ask the next question. Why not just say, I'd wake and hear the house. I'd wake and I would awake to hear the fire burning in the house. Or my father built a fire in the cold with his hands. Why not just say the basic information? Certain things are being emphasized here. And a really good thing to do with all literature, particularly with poetry, is not just ask what's being said, but ask, how is this being said? And how do these specific words create the specific meaning of this moment, the feelings of this moment? Blue, black, cold is different than it's really cold. And, um, getting warmer feels different than cold, splintering, breaking. So it's almost as if the father's acts of love are done in this like harsh environment. I don't know. It's really, really interesting. Um, what is the poems? So all of these questions I'm asking apply to different poems differently, right? Some poems are heavily image based and some poems are heavily figurative language based. So this is just a list of possible entry points. So strongest or most surprising image. Cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made bank fires blaze. So that's a visual image. And then an auditory image. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering breaking. And then speaking indifferently to him, kind of an auditory image, and then more visual imagery. Um, so the images go from the fact that he has cracked hands, and he definitely mentions that they ache. What do they ache from? Labor in the weekday weather. So he's a laboring man. Why mention weekday weather? Because on this guy's day off, Sundays too, he's taking care of his family and doing the hard work of love. Okay? But this image gives us that information and that feeling and that intensity of his love. Without this image, if it just says, my father got up on Sundays and made a fire so it wouldn't be cold, we don't get that. That's another trick too, I should mention. If you're ever wondering what's the importance of the way this is said, spark note it, say it in a basic rudimentary way, and then compare the poem with the spark notes. So if this first stanza was, my father used to build fires for us so we wouldn't get cold, and type that, and then look at this, you're noticing an entirely different, more detailed, nuanced person exists in Hayden's poem. We get the sound of the fire and the cold breaking, and we also get the way he speaks to his father. And then we get another detail of another kindness of the father. So the father does two kindnesses. The father builds this fire deliberately, even though he's tired and cold. And the father also on Sunday, maybe because they're going to church or whatever, polishes the boy's good shoes, which is a very gentle act of kindness. So the images do a lot of work here to help create character and mood and tone. So another thing, and this is I was going to delete this, but then I thought, well, this is a way into certain poems. Some poems rest on one metaphor, one symbol, one image, whatever. So figurative language is often important. Sometimes the way we talk about something, the way we describe something, is just by comparing it to somebody else. So, one of my students referred to a guy in his basketball team as a monster. He didn't literally mean he was a monster. He just meant he was sort of an uncontrollable force in the court. We do this all the time, and poets have a particular affinity for this. So what's interesting here is a complete lack of figurative language, right? And sometimes it's good to notice what's not in a text. So something I'll mention later is there's lots of stories that aren't told here because that's not the poem that Hayden wanted to write. But we have a series of very visceral images in the beginning with that sort of bald, bare last thought, no one ever thanked him. And we have more, bare language, more language. And I guess love having, the duties of love, that's maybe figurative language, but what's interesting about this poem is that it avoids floweriness. And I'm just going to throw this out. The son, you could argue, who's speaking this poem, writes poetry like his father loves. His father loves in an austere, bare bones, honest way. Complicated but honest. If this poem was full of flowery language, it wouldn't reflect the love of the father, but the poem kind of does, and I find that really interesting. Another thing to do, and this isn't discussed, I enjoy acting and I enjoy theater. Some poems are theatrical. So, how are characters developed theatrically? Are there moments of dramatic blocking, like a very intentional staging of a moment? Who's doing what, where on the stage? Things like that. So let's look. I mean, father got up early, put his clothes on. We'd get his hands and then he makes a fire. Think of it as cinematography too. We can imagine the camera watching him get up, put his clothes on in the cold. Then the camera zooms in to the details of the cracks in his hand, and then we move to making a fire, and then we move to an entirely different part of the house where we get the speaker as a child and what the speaker hears, and then how the speaker dresses and what the speaker fears, and then the speaker, we don't get the dialogue, but the speaker speaks to his father in a particular way, and then we get an echo of what the father does, and then a thought, which isn't necessarily theatrical in the same way. We get a lot of actions. We don't get a lot of theatrical details, but we do move around in a house and we zoom in and out. So another thing to do is to think about where the camera moves in this poem. Something Billy Collins says that I really like is, instead of asking yourself, what does a poem mean, as if it's the Pythagorean theorem or something, ask how the poem moves. So Billy Collins says, I'm trying to write poems that involve beginning at a known place and ending up at a slightly different place. I'm trying to take a little journey from one place to another, and it's usually from a realistic place to a place in the imagination. So how does the poem move? So let's look at that. Sundays too, my father got up early. So we start seemingly in the middle of a moment. Sundays too, like we were just talking about this. My father got up early and put his clothes on, and it blew back cold. Okay, and then we move where? To his hands, making a fire. And then we move where? In the speaker's head. So in the very beginning, we're with the father and with the son. And then we stay with the son. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering breaking. And then time passes, the rooms are warm. Father would call, very basic information. When the rooms were warm, he'd call. And then the boy acts slowly. And then we move to his heart. Inside, he fears. And then he does stuff. He speaks indifferently. So the boy isn't altogether an innocent party to this. Because he then admits his father's done other kindnesses. We move back to the father. And then we move to the present moment where the boy as a man experiences regret. So we move around a house, we move between characters, and we move in time. And any of those are worth thinking about more. How the poem moves physically, how the poem moves between characters, and how the poem moves between describing moments in the world and describing moments in the speaker's head. I think that's what Billy Collins is talking about there. And then always, so if you're doing Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, the title doesn't help you. There's nothing 73-ish about it. But if the title's interesting or surprising, how does it serve as a part of the poem? Those Winter Sundays is an interesting title. Imagine other titles and how they would work. That's a good conversation to have. There feels to be a tinge of regret even in the title, if I'm going to be honest. So this to me is one of the key questions for anybody trying to read literature on a deeper level. Not necessarily write research papers, but just to read for more than plot. You know, what did I feel or notice? And what did the poet do to make me feel or notice it? That's the nature of art, right? Any artist gets us to pay attention in the way she wants us to pay attention, right? So that's a good question. And I tell my students this: if you ever take an art class, whether you're good at it or not, and there's a gallery showing of your artwork, the greatest favor someone can do is just stand in front of it and pay close attention to it. That's honoring your work. That's what we're doing here, okay? Okay, so I'm going to go through my sort of final thoughts. Now, I am not finished thinking about the poem. There's a zillion other things to think about. Sundays too, my father got up early, put his clothes on in the blue-black cold, And with cracked hands that ached from labor and the weekday weather made bank fires blaze, no one ever thanked him. Okay. Sundays, too, his dad does these small acts of love every day. Blue, black, cold, cracked hands ached. Doing these thankless tasks was hard for him in a specific way, in the way of an exhausted parent who still continues loving. And the last sentence is heartbreaking, but it feels like an afterthought. It doesn't even get its own line. And the speaker doesn't mention himself, but the less personal, no one. So in this first stanza, to me, the speaker and the father seem miles apart. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I'd rise and dress, fearing chronic angers of that house. The focus here shifts to the speaker and his response to the father. So here we're going to get a little technical, but what I'm doing is I'm giving technical language to stuff I've already noticed. I always tell my students, if you do have to talk deeply or write deeply about poetry, use poetry terms. I don't want my mechanic to tell me the thing that makes a weird noise, the boxy thing with the wires in it under the hood there, that's broken and we need to fix it. Even though I don't know about cars, I want my mechanic to use car terms when he talks to me. Sometimes these poetry terms are important to use because they just make our realization specific. That's all. So there's harsh, consonant-heavy sounds like splintering, breaking. And what I have here, this poem, not that it matters, but is a sonnet. And the backbeat of the poem is iambic. It's rising rhythms. When the rooms were warm, he'd call. The rooms were warm, he'd call. And rise and dress. Here, we get falling rhythms, splintering, breaking. So the harshness of those sounds echo the harshness of the environment that they're discussing. And that's a really cool thing to notice. We're literally sort of looking under the hood of the poem to see how it works. And we don't do it to hyperanalyze. We do it because knowledge should enhance our enjoyment of the thing. Slowly I would rise and dress leads to fearing. So it's almost like he's even hesitant to get out of bed. The word chronic, as I mentioned earlier, does a lot of work. It's a clinical kind of word, but it reflects a day-to-day life of fear that will not go away. The house contains both love and fear. And I'm just noticing what's not here. It's interesting, we never get the details behind the fear. An interesting conversation with a group of folks, or if you want to journal about it, is why? Other than that it's not the poem Hayden set out to write. What would be the poem that delineated the details of why the speaker fears? Speaking indifferently to him who driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well, what did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Here the speaker finally remembers what he did, and it's embarrassing, especially when he remembers other kindnesses of his father. What did the speaker do? He spoke indifferently to his father, like his father was just in the way. I have teenagers. I know what this is like. The last two lines are the two most heartbreaking lines of poetry I know. That's a fact. Perfectly expressed moment of regret, everything about it. Questions. Is this an apology? Is this him admitting that when he was young, he couldn't understand adult love? Is this something else? What about the weird wording of the last line? It's almost as if realizing the nature of adult loving, which is like unsexy, basic, full of little moments like this that no one pays attention to, right? It's almost like when he figures out what adult love actually looks like, he uses older person's language to talk about it. Like the words themselves reflect the aging and maturity of the speaker. Now, is that true? Did he sit and intend that? I don't know, but it's there. And I noticed it. And that's just brilliant. With all of those thoughts, go back and read your poem again. Never stop going back to the original text. There's nothing that I can say that's smart, that's as interesting as the poem. And just the more I think about the poem and reflect on it, the poem gets richer and richer. That's the point of this. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold, splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold, and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Okay, last but not least, almost done. 3 important tips to put your mind at ease. First, the goal of reading poetry is not to sound smart or to unlock the meaning of a poem. Okay? You can have more than one goal. I'm not saying there's only one way to read it or one reason to read it, but I'm pretty sure that there isn't a serious poet in the world that says, you know what, when I write this poem out of my very guts, the most important thing is you have to sound really smart when you talk about it. It's not the case. The world is not a high school classroom. And I, as a high school teacher, need to always be mindful of that. 2, we have Inigo Montoya here. I had a student the other day make a Princess Bride reference. I wanted to give him an A for the whole quarter. Caution number 2, knowing poetic terms is good. I mentioned iambic pentameter earlier, and we've mentioned figurative language. Knowing poetic terms is good, but it's not an end unto itself. I often have students will say, oh, look, personification, anaphora, metaphor, whatever. And the next question is, why did the poet use that? Why are you noticing that? So noticing, it's sort of like if my mechanic said, your brake pads are worn. Isn't that interesting? Okay, well, what are you going to do? Like, what's the point of telling me that, right? That's important. And last but not least, focus on the human in the poem. Why did the author have to write this? Is there any piece of this poem that I understand from my experience? Is there anything interesting to me that is also utterly foreign to me? Could I live any piece of this poem in my real life? Think about that. And I hope this video helps you just appreciate poetry more and approach it more honestly and authentically and with a way that doesn't intimidate you, but in a way that makes you love poetry more and more intensely. Have a good day and keep in touch as to whether any of this helps or if you have any suggestions. Thank you.